Hello everyone, today we talk about the Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily, if you want to exclude it from the former, a topic that, believe it or not, we never dedicated an entire video to on Schwerpunkt after several years of medieval warfare content. Telling the truth, we never really talked that much about medieval southern Italian history in general. Naturally, I have something in the tens of videos about that. This video is a military history, so we're going to look at the wall conquest of the south of Sicily. At some point, we're going to make more specific campaigns videos focusing on every single, not just campaign and expedition, because this didn't happen just in one shot, obviously. It's a pretty complicated, fragmented military history, especially the beginning. Right, we made videos also about the more mature phase of this sum of territories that, in fact, up until the beginning of the 12th century and in a relatively incidental way, eventually became, let's say, got unified into a whole kingdom. This actually was a self-appointment that eventually was recognized by the papacy. I made some videos about the papal German expeditions against the Siculo-Normans, and so, again, it's a relatively complicated history. That shows, indeed, however, also how, until the time of Roger II, I made a video biography on, in fact, this vast territory, pretty big, and especially enormously populated and incredibly rich, was truly brought under a single unified rule, right? A single monarchy, a single crown specifically. So today we will have a way to partially look at this, but there are different angles from which to approach and or from which to depart from this topic, as far as for example, like the origin of the Normans. What do we mean by them, right? The synecdoche. Who were these people at the beginning, for example, of the conquest and at the end of the conquest? They meant at some point different things. In a narrower way, this was the Northmen, literally like almost a continuation of the Vikings, the Scandinavian and Norse expeditions. At the end, we're talking about a major synecdoche, right, of not just, of course, we have the Siculo-Norman king, we have the Anglo-Norman one, we have the Duchy of Normandy, obviously before the latter being established, as we've seen also in a recent video about Rollo, way before this time, but still, right, the Normans in many ways were Western Franks. They were sometimes also Eastern Franks, Lombards, you name them, really. And this is something I'm not probably going to indulge on too much in this video, because we, again, mostly talk about the military side of the story, even though this is going to emerge as a topic. We're not going to sort of split hair on this. In any case, it's an enormous topic also as far as the Norman encounter as a mature Western Frankish military culture. There is no doubt about this. From a military standpoint, we're not talking about the Vikings, right? It's something completely different. It's the product of Western civilization. It's in its most advanced Basilitic beneficiary Christian and eventually royal form, against the variously, for different reasons, the Longobards of southern Italy, the Byzantines of Constantinople, the Arabs of Sicily. And so all polities that we already encounter, of course, in various ways. I have hundreds of videos on Byzantine Empire. We talked about the Saracens. We even talk about Langobardia Minor, right? Shall make actually more videos about that. But this, obviously, while giving way to some important syncrasies also in the Siculo-Norman army organization that we'll surely make multiple videos on at some point, was indeed the encounter, in fact, of a Western way of war with a more sort of behind-lagging one to some extent. We made some videos, for example, about the Battle of the Iraqian. We observed in that instance how, for example, this entire European Mediterranean space was the theater of a broader clash, thinking about the Siculo-Norman rivalry with the Anglo-Danish Varangian refugees in Constantinople that we've seen, in fact, on the battlefields of Epirus. You can look at that also from my series about the Komnenoi. You can look at John Balliol in Amazeia, the connection with Manzikert. There was really a lot behind this. I made a video about the Italo-Norman horseman in particular that has some characteristic on its own. There are also broader civilizational, political, religious themes. One of the Crusades, we made a video about Bohemond of Taranto, for example. We have never really made a video comparison between the Anglo-Normans and the Siculo-Normans. I've always been struck by the fact that ever since I started talking about the Normans of southern Italy, that some people out there, like on social media and pop culture, self-styled amateurs of the Normans, literally ignore at some point, and in some other cases sideline even, the Siculo-Norman theater is some sort of spin-off secondary aspect of the more sort of Anglo-centric side of the story. But as a matter of fact, the Kingdom of Sicily was actually bigger, more important, more powerful, and more relevant in this sense of the English one even. We're talking about, of course, by comparison in scale, the same, but there is no doubt, as we've seen also in some videos about the later king, the Swabian, the Angevin Kingdom of Sicily, that this was actually a more powerful economic entity than England was, even at the peak of its medieval capacity. So obviously these countries follow different paths, but there is a specific Southern Italian background to this that very few people, aside from all those videos about, oh, look, the genetic mixtures, like Southern Italians are closer to Levantines, whatever, completely miss in a historiographical, political, including ethnic, cultural, social sense, right? There is a rich history of pre-Norman Southern Italy that, first of all, explains, as we will partially try to do today, why the Normans took over, why this was an incredible success of Western civilization, of the Franks, of Rome, and all the various peoples that took part to the conquest. In many ways, Sicily, as you know, became a launching pad for expeditions toward the Holy Land against North Africa. It really represented the single sort of biggest power next to the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Byzantine Empire, at least if you still consider the phase by which the French had yet to arrive to the Mediterranean in Capetian sort of strategic terms. And so that's also another story, and we will surely continue with more videos about Swabian, Angevin, Aragonese, Southern Italy, because it's so very important as well. And what it's in fact usually missed and accomplices a bit also the feudal culture that the Normans brought with themselves in an otherwise, a bit like in Britain, like these were not previously feudalized countries. All right, they were heading toward that direction, but the courtly styles tend to to obscure the relevance of the actual lands, of the actual communities, of the other powers that helped establish a more stringent political and territorial control. We recently talked about the Genoese, the peasants, that at some point end up heavily involved in the management of, for example, the Southern Italian ports in the hands of the Hauteville. So it's an enormous history that I think on Schwerpunkt we should start giving really the scope and the relevance it really deserves. Not that we really haven't, but we haven't done by the degree it really deserves that. You have everything in the top fixed comment down below, so you can search on YouTube, my channel, the various playlists, so everything is out there. But let's try, very simply, again, this is just really an introduction, to tell the history of the Norman conquest of southern Italy. I will include Sicily in the expression here so that we don't misunderstand each other since the beginning. So this conquest unfolded as a protracted military undertaking spanning nearly 2 centuries. All right, so it wasn't something done from a day to another. It wasn't, in the sense, since the beginning, like a majorly planned to seize the entirety of the south. Naturally, opportunities were rising. There were very important signals out there. The Normans, for example, were just like, I don't know, this is something you see also in the Reconquista. You see in other contexts that you wouldn't immediately or intuitively think about, that they were allied with the Muslims of Sicily in some cases. They had friends there that had been fighting as mercenaries for them. This also facilitated the conquest of Sicily. There was albeit long. It took taking longer time than England, much less brutal than, in fact, the Norman conquest of England. This was one of the single most traumatically shocking chapters in the history of the medieval West, right? And at least, fully commensurate to the situation, William the Conqueror was not a tender-hearted person, as we've seen also in our recent video about the Bretons, but that was also the only and actually successful way to control the Anglo-Danes and to establish, in fact, one of really the most important kingdoms in Western Christendom, right? But it's really different. And it's really different as far as we talk about the Southern Italian mainland, right? If you're interested, by the way, in a bit like the prodromes of this, I have that interview I made months ago with Eastern Roman history. I also made a video myself after that, which is basically the same script that I repeated for a video of mine. And so you will find that, even Eastern Roman video and my participation in the live on my channel in the playlists about Byzantine Italy, that tells really Southern Italy at that point. It really tells you a lot of why, right? First of all, what this land really was. There is this idea that it was quote-unquote Byzantine. For some reason, people overly emphasize the quote-unquote Greek character of Southern Italy that historically barely had much to do with it, if not in some sort of culturally dominant sense in some very specific parts, especially the coastal cities, right? But this had historically been an Italic, now Longobard hinterland, right? That had also very difficult, so to say, if anything, just to learn, for us to learn history. This, especially talking about the second invasions, we've seen it in the Western Frankish kingdom with the Vikings, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom with the Magyars. Italy was not simply prey of the second invaders. The Saracens were very often invited by the same Longobard dukes that were fighting against each other, or the Byzantine Empire. And there is really a core civilization that gets a bit always underplayed, either in favor of the Byzantines or the Greeks in antiquity. Much of the very few, the really minimal amount of Greek-speaking communities in southern Italy today, there are much bigger Albanian ones, for example, coming from the refugees of the Ottoman conquest from the Balkans in the 15th century, and or others along the way, do come from mostly the Middle Ages, right? They're not much of a relic of an Hellenic, classical Hellenic colonization in antiquity. So it's important to get to know this specific southern Italian communities, their identity. We alluded to them in so many different contexts. For example, I made a video about Byzantine warfare from the 11th to the 14th century, which describes, especially in the first part, the military organization of the southern Italian cities, towns, of, say, the pre-Norman time, because we started, in fact, around the mid-11th century. And these were actually the single better military organized towns of the entire Byzantine Empire. Something that, among other things, you want to appreciate, also because this ended up in the Siculo-Norman army as levies, etc. So, again, we'll make plenty of videos. We still haven't really done, even in terms of military historical unit, the Italo-Norman one was sort of the only one. But for telling you what kind of characters we're discussing in general. So if we were to draw this chronological arc, we have to start from the initial arrival of knights around 999, which we've seen exactly in that video about the Byzantines, as contractors of some sort. They were usually escorts for the pilgrims that wanted to reach the Holy Land. Yet another very interesting story. I made a video about Fulk Nerra that way before the canonic age of Crusade normally went over to the Holy Land, I think a couple of times on a regular basis, for how common this actually was, how much, contrary to the idea of an involved Western Dark Ages, the Westerners were all over the place since ever, right? In particular, the Italians, that at this point, especially with the maritime republics, the one of Amalfi had been actually the first most important in a canonic sense, and it was a southern one. I also made a video about it. were already truly shaping especially the Western and Central Mediterranean, already traded extensively in the Eastern one. The ending point would be the definitive establishment of a unified rule, technically not even at the beginning of the 12th century, but literally at the end of the Hauteville, and actually the death of Henry VI. For different reasons. We will not go that far because we will mostly stop to the 1130s, but bear in mind that there were some historical ambiguities in how this kingdom also had to be seen in a broader sense, whether, for example, at that point under the Hohenstaufen, as a part of the Holy Roman Empire, that never really was, this was technically a papal fief from the 12th century and before. Given we're talking about the Swabians here, there's a very specific participation of even more specifically Swabian mercenaries among the various Germans that existed at this point in history, at the famous Battle of Civitate. There we will see now the Normans crushed the papal army, composed in fact of Romans, of actual Romans from Rome, Italy, Longobards, and Swabian mercenaries. Those famous 1.5-handed swordsmen fighting on foot that were eventually overrun by the quite dreadfully orderly and compact as shocking Norman cavalry charges, right? So overall, it's a massive military history, mostly concentrated from the mid-11th to the early 12th century. These campaigns involved coordinated efforts by multiple Norman families beyond just the prominent Hauteville, that eventually seized the entire wall as kings, incorporating strategic marriages with local Longobard nobility to legitimize holdings and secure supply lines across rugged terrain that included the mountainous interiors of Apulia, where limestone plateaus and deep river valleys created natural choke points for controlling movement. The Southern Italian hinterland, as the Allies in World War II, is one of the single most nightmarish theaters in military theaters in Europe. Southern Europe is a veritable nightmare. We don't know whether the Meseta or the Apennine or the Balkan Mountains are actually the worst for anybody fighting there in history. In fact, it took forever for the Normans themselves to assert any actual sort of direct control over the Longobard principalities. Were very well nested and rocked in the Apennine hinterland, very differently from Sicily, for example, and the Byzantine coastland, interestingly enough. In fact, you have the coastal approaches to key ports like Bari and Otranto on the Strait, with the Balkans that facilitated naval resupply from across the Adriatic. Right? There's all a geography you have to go that way. And again, it's a pretty big part, pretty large part of Europe, right? The reticulate projections on geographical maps tend to show in a more conventional sense the West, like as if, I don't know, Scandinavia was enormous. It is actually enormous, but much bigger than it actually is. When you look at Southern Italy, it seems small, but it's actually a really vast territory. This is incredibly important to stress. We're not talking about the level of development overall, right? Today, I will perhaps not really indulge too much on the broader, like how or why Southern Italy had stayed so fragmented up to that point for half of a millennium or so, apparently, only because telling the truth, the Southern Longobards had almost succeeded at some point in taking everything over, like when the kingdom also as a whole was still intact, right? But how is that the Normans come to rule over this land that does not seem to have, in fact, a unitary national character per se? Telling the truth, much of it is again there in that Italo-Longobardic hinterland one. But there's no doubt that, again, Sicily is something different, for example, that there are these chunks of Byzantine coastal areas more connected, in fact, with the Aegean, by sea, by fleet, etc. So that's yet another big question. These were very advanced areas, but still not formally orderly, right? The central northern Italian world, arguably since Roman times, was actually something more recognizably stable and already formally controllable and established as a as a real hub of national identity. In fact, the Lombards eventually were what was the term used to describe Italians by everybody outside of Italy, except the Italians, at least until they were abroad, by the Arabs, by the Franks, etc. And that should be explained as well, because again, we're talking, especially before the Roman conquest, again, the South being more advanced than the North. And many people arguing, they tend to sort of claim down the line when the North, the center, surpassed the South specifically. And it actually started happening much earlier than it's commonly believed. Right? If you have especially a sense of the political institutional history of the era, and you actually acknowledge the fact it wasn't much, where there's no political unity, there's not really even much of a true civilizational quality. You can be very rich, very resourceful. I mean, Southern Italy was overwhelmingly, that still today is fertile, right? And even for a pre-industrial economy, that was not enough, right? This will stay, like up to the 18th century. We're talking about an incredibly large amount of wealth, which makes, in fact, the Norman kingdom even more towering in the international landscape, right? But you must explain also why they had been apparently exhausted. That these areas had been taken over, ravaged by other peoples. They had not been able to give each other some kind of full unity, other than a political one, especially with the decline and fragmentation of the Duchy of Benevent during the 9th century. All history that we'll have to properly call. The Normans capitalized in particular from the post-Basil II's Byzantine crisis. That really changed much. There was probably an over-exhaustion of resources all across the empire because of those campaigns against the Bulgarians and beyond. We've seen, in fact, the situation in Italy being very decentralized from Constantinople, to say the least, even in the commonly said, that basically was a Byzantine Greek South. No, it was basically an Italo-Lombard one, and it was basically on its own terms for quite a long time as such. The Byzantines maintaining a coastal presence, fundamentally, not much of control or a capacity to simply, even socio-culturally, mold the Southern Italian hinterland. And Sicily, then, it's another story. It's under the Arabs. We will see it now. That was much less rugged in terms of social-cultural cohesion. As we said before, like Southern Italian hinterland was, in fact, very difficult to control by anyone, right? Sicily went smoothly. It took time, again, to clear all those various nests in the Enna Mountains, etc. But overall, these weren't particularly bloody issues. Many Arabs did come back to Africa during the conquest, also unveiling the most obvious realization that, in fact, Sicily was a Romance country, right? There were some important, as you know, Greek-speaking, if any, communities. There were even Basilian monks in exile up mountain to escape the ravages of the Saracens, etc. But as the Islamic mist clears, the Normans come to rule over de facto a Latin country, and there is also further colonization. Lots of Franks come from the north. There are, even still today, in the very heartland of Sicily, there is a Lombard, northern Italian dialect spoken, stemming literally from the, in fact, northern Lombard colonists that settled there to maintain as a military colony, in particular, that strategic cornerstone for the domination of Sicily. The Hauteville, they are the protagonists here, descended from the minor lord Tancred, that was originally of the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy. A region, as you know, characterized also other times in military history by its bocage landscapes of hedgerows and small holdings that fostered hardy, independent warriors accustomed to raiding and skirmishing, exemplifying this through their numerous sons who distributed commands and mitigated succession risks via familiar cooperation amid rivalries, right? The Hauteville had basically come at this point from, again, this area in northwestern Normandy. They had been no strangers to those wars we described recently also with on the Breton frontier in the west. The Cotentin Peninsula, as you probably know, compared to the rest of Normandy, has a much higher concentration of Norse genetic ancestry. And we can't imagine what this man had been about. It had been settled from Scandinavia in relatively recent times. It's not like even the art of war had particularly changed throughout this time, except indeed the Normans of Normandy really much better horsemen, and bringing there some shock charges. They actually are the same ones of the Western Frankish world, right? If you want, they are a literal copy, militarily speaking, of what the Franks as a whole were doing pretty darn well. But of course, their epopee as really mythical riders, right? That hadn't they been stopped, they would have pursued broken enemies up to the gates of Babylon. Some chroniclers, in particular military instances, said is famous to all, and mostly revolves actually around the conquest of southern Italy, as opposed to even England, that obviously was yet another legendary, albeit actually historical endeavor, right? Itinerant forces from Normandy entered southern Italy initially as mercenaries, serving Lombard and Byzantine factions amid ongoing rivalries. There is a much older history of Germanic war bands, mercenaries. Think about this since literally Roman times. Like, we think at some point the barbarians are arriving, so that's when the Germans, you start to see that this started since the beginning, from the Germano-Italic encounter. It continued throughout the entirety of the early Middle Ages. The Saxons, for example, in Charlemagne's times, were actually very famous mercenaries. They fought as far as the Spanish mark. Admittedly, also, the Lombards from conquered Italy were brought to fight with elite scare, as a matter of fact, some of the finest elements of the Carolingian armies in all the various frontiers, including the same German one, or the one against the Avars, right? So there was, I have the impression that when pop culture wants to overly provincialize, in fact, group identity, tends to completely miss and even distance itself from the realization that Europeans were all much closer to each other from an incredibly old time than we want to recognize. And military service in this sense is one of the prominent reasons for this, right? Poor Northern Europeans that were attracted naturally to southern wealth, either as soldiers for hire and or plunderers. Look at what the Varangians achieved in Constantinople. I also, as you know, have a 3 videos long series on the saga of Harald Hardrada, as a matter of fact, that partially sort of overlaps with the stories, is quite telling. In fact, before the Normans, right, the Varangians had already tried, the Byzantines had already attempted the reconquest of Sicily, even with this Norse elements, right, in the imperial army, right. The Normans had been transmitting reports of Mediterranean opportunities that encouraged further migration from the overpopulated duchy in northern France, that didn't have overwhelming amount of resources, but these people were, in any case, ever more intimately sewed into the fabric of this broader Frankish civilization. So they also, through a demographic push, not differently from what happened from Scandinavia, were exuberatingly expanding elsewhere. This is typical, again, of the Germanic side of Europe, since from a very long time. And their primogeniture left many younger sons landless and eager for fortune in the vassalic beneficiary system of France, where they originated. Such reports highlighted the wealth of fertile plains in Apulia, that is really that rich, in fact, known for its grain production vital to Mediterranean trade networks, and the trading ports of the Amalfi Coast, famous for their maritime expertise and connections to Byzantine and Islamic markets. Drawing additional waves of land-hungry younger sons from overpopulated Norman estates, where divided inheritances under partible customs had intensified competition for limited resources. The more you go back in time, the more you can extremize that, because the more you go back in time, the Normans as some sort of true Norse pirates coming from God knows where, and so living conditions were far from ideal. And in the same level, at the same level, the more you go back in time, the Muslims have actually the upper hand in the trade balance in the Mediterranean, which doesn't mean that they were actually qualitatively more advanced, especially of the northern shores of the Mediterranean. Quite the contrary, but there was really a lot of wealth circulating, right? Palermo in Sicily was not, in fact, there wasn't even a big deal of Islamic civilizational development in places like that. It wasn't really like Cordoba or Baghdad or Cairo. But we know that it was a pretty large market, right? So whoever had the boldness, the strength, and the vision to capitalize on this would venture for the south, right? The Byzantine military was, as you know, the among the most advanced in the world at this point, so it offered really pretty solid gold standards, literally also in the rewards. Sometimes they literally subcontracted the Varangians the territories, like they allowed for great part of the entirety of the plunder for those Greek islands could be reconquered from the Saracens, letting the Norse doing essentially the same thing they did as raiders in northern European waters and beyond. So these early Normans that appear are pretty rough, pretty archaic, so to say, operating in fragmented political environments dominated by Longobards principalities like those in Salerno and Capua. Byzantine catapans, that this was the Greek transliteration of the Latin capitane, captains, administering from bases like Bari, that was really the most important center, a very, in that sense, Greek city. Again, if anything, from a cultural, linguistic point of view, then the origins, as we've seen also in many cases, could be pretty far, especially in the patriciate. It was mostly local Lombard, etc., but some rebels had come even from as far as Armenia, etc. We've seen it well in that video about Byzantine Southern Italy. And of course, like the Islamic Emirates controlling Sicilian territories. Gradually, having the Normans gradually transition into autonomous lords, establishing independent holdings through sustained campaigning across decades rather than any singular decisive engagement. Right, that's the process. Right, they are hired, some stay, they're involved for providing actual military service to the Longobards, to other lords. Some of them are, again, literally fighting in Sicily already in the inter-Islamic clashes between an emir and another, meaning that they knew Sicily already pretty well with generations before the conquest, and this obviously was very instrumental. They had ties, planetary connections in there. This gradualism almost allowed Normans to exploit shifting alliances, such as temporary pacts, in fact, with Islamic factions in Sicily that provided intelligence on rival emirates' weaknesses, including internal divisions among Kalbid rulers that had weakened concentrated authority since the late 10th century, when dynastic feuds fragmented emirate cohesion following the death of key unifying figures. Unlike the rapid resolution in England following one major battle, even though, as we've seen with the Herring of the North, it took a while to subdue the Anglo-Danish by literally hammering them into subjection, the Southern Italian process involved numerous independent conquests, later consolidated with mainland structures such as counties and lordships retaining enduring administrative significance even after unification. Right, this was the character. It was a coalescing basidic beneficiary mechanism. You see, the Normans are witnessed for the first time in southern Italy just sort of 80 years after Rollo has settled in Normandy. Right, in 1066 you have an actual expedition by a major Western principality, the Duchy of Normandy. William the Conqueror is literally joining a crusade that is being properly launched by the papacy. It's something much more institutionalized, right? What happened in southern Italy eventually will actually go like that, especially the conquest of Sicily. But aside from the fact that it took longer to conquer than England, it had this background of much more granular and gradual conquest of southern Italian mainland. It is an incredibly complicated territory, very differently from Sicily, right? That would, in fact, be ruled in later history much more easily than southern Italy. There is already also some vassalatic, say, we said it before, southern Italy had not been fully feudalized, but let's say when you look especially at the Longobards, they had been some sort of client states of both the Byzantines, but mostly the Franks, and there were sort of, this was, again, pretty advanced lands that had a very long tradition, some of the most civilized regions in the world. And so the Normans invariably established themselves in this war. But what they actually bring that is innovative is the level of scale of Western Frankish seigneury, right? In France, some magnates were sort of much more powerful than even Italic kings at some point. We have seen this since Longobard times. It was simply a much different distribution of wealth, right? In Gaul, very few people controlled practically everything. In Italy, per capita wealth was the highest in the world, and say there weren't enormous feudal conglomerations of power. This is what partially kept Italy politically divided. When the Normans arrived, they instead literally changed the scale of local seigneury, right? There are very interesting studies, for example, on 11th century, 12th century Abruzzo that showed how there were some counts locally, part of the Holy Roman Empire, because there was always this ambiguity in central Italy, what actually belonged to the Holy Roman emperors, etc. The Normans arrive and, say, establish a seigneury was 10 times larger than that, right? So it's a completely different level thinking that is essentially Western Frankish, really deeply French. Obviously, they spoke French, regardless of this anecdotal character of the Normans that were, as a term that we're telling you, for the vast majority, at least the dominant majority, is French. The fact is what will become French. Right, but again, they came from many different eras. There were French, there were Occitanians, there were German, there were Italian of different type. Like, so you have really a pretty mixed bunch. At some point, we will make videos explaining this. I already made, for example, a video about the first generation of especially the Norman rule of Sicily, and so with already southern Italy conquered, that partially describes this, and it does give you a pretty good idea of what also the various communities, the various languages, etc., because it's a complicated story. Now, the aforementioned counties that the Normans established, sometimes, again, literally installing themselves on somebody else's rule, including one of other Norman mercenaries had already been felt that way, often preserved Longobard legal customs in land tenure, right? Just think that we explained partially this in the series about medieval law that eventually arrived up to the contemporary era, just by showing you the trail that up to the 19th century, so pre-unitary Italy, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, I don't remember what they're up to because there were different reforms, but up to the 18th or even the 19th century, still used Longobard law as customary law. This is incredibly fascinating, right? This was no more, say, in northern Italy even. And for what we were saying before, that the actual Italic people in southern Italy were identified as Longobards, and as we've seen also in the video about Byzantine Italy, that quote-unquote Byzantine rule was over Longobards, in part. And so it's obvious that the Normans would fundamentally adapt in mainland Italy along the pattern of this custom, this ethnic custom. Indeed, in fact, this customs in land tenure in particular were rooted in earlier 8th and 9th century practices of the Longobard kingdoms, right? While introducing normal feudal obligations in a more updated sense, in a more meaning Western Frankish sense, for knight service, creating a hybrid system that enhanced stability by blending local inheritance traditions with military service requirements that required vassals to provide mounted troops for seasonal campaigns. There are very beautiful later Hauteville era lists probably of knightly service. We have them for the major monarchies in Europe, and Sicily had the large. I think the entire kingdom on paper or parchment better owed something like over 5,000 knights. They naturally were not summonable from a day to another, right? But gives you an idea of the Kingdom of Sicily being literally the largest, where such imposition was possible in that time in history. Now, preceding full-scale Norman involvement, limited Viking activity had occurred, right? There is a small but sort of relevant Italian side of Viking history. By the way, beautifully, this also happened much later. There are all the Longobard stones, especially in Sweden, right? You have all these runic inscriptions speaking of all these various Northmen. It also shows how many Scandinavians there actually were among the Normans, also up to pretty late in time. So the various expeditions to southern Italy, including through the Byzantine side, importantly enough at that point, but at some point there's going even to be a Norwegian crusade in the 12th century. We can make a video about that. So these places were no strangers to the Northmen historically. In fact, there had been raids around 860 by fleets that reached, famously enough, as far as Luna. We're talking essentially the boundary between northern and central, between Liguria and Tuscany. Under leaders associated with Astein and Björn Ironside, they thought that Luna was Rome, by the way, just for making you understand that a bit the different horizons of civilization within Europe at the time. Famously enough, employing deception to breach defenses before withdrawing with plunder that demonstrated the vulnerability of Italian coastal defenses to Norse longships equipped with shallow drafts ideal for riverine penetration. We've seen this also in the 11th century video about Genoese warfare, that up to that point the Saracens were also pretty active there, and that at some point there is a brutal coming back, especially starting from Genoa and Pisa, that up to this point, however, had not been major naval powers, right? It actually had been the Southern Italians, with Amalfi in particular, that had been more of that. So the Ligurian and Tyrrhenian seas had taken a bit more time in the north to take off, right? And in any case, this Viking raids were fundamentally inconsequential in the broader political picture of the Italian peninsula. Mercenary service by Norsemen intensified, with Varangians under Harald Hardrada participating in the 1038-1040 Byzantine effort against Sicilian Muslims alongside Norman contingents led by William Ironarm and Longobard allies. Harald's Varangians contributed elite heavy infantry expertise, though not only. Honed in Byzantine service across the empire, including campaigns in Anatolia that complemented Norman cavalry charges during assaults on coastal strongholds, where their disciplined shield walls provided crucial support in close quarters, fighting against Saracen levies, often reliant on lighter skirmish tactics. What is actually fascinating is that, first of all, right, the Normans and the Varangians did not really like each other very much. In fact, they argued over the spoils and similar things. This was a bit of a problem, the quite multicultural army of the Byzantine Empire. But the Normans were evidently already expressing a more advanced way of war. That is the same one that will basically crush, in fact, the same Anglo-Danes at Hastings as much as at the Dyrrhachion. And one thing that often sort of gets a bit forgotten in all this is that there's no doubt on the ultra elite character of Varangian heavy infantry, right? Their performance is naturally well sort of documented in some crack roles, including storming enemy fortifications and such. However, we're talking this first of all in a Mediterranean context, where in the sense Western sort of broader Frankish civilization had not yet sort of fully coalesced, consolidated, which was happening for the Normans though. And so you are fighting actually against softer enemies of some sort. And we tend to forget that actually the Varangians in large part were also, in actually larger part, much more lightly equipped forces than we think. Equally, there were much more horsemen, right? That we don't see in the palace guard. That was mostly, again, they did have cavalry there too, but let's say the myth is almost the video game unit or the elite Varangian guard. But there were lots of people coming from northern Eastern Europe that were regularly settled in the Balkans in particular as some sort of something like peasant labor and military colonies, so to say, as long as somebody lived there, right? And so something could be extracted in forms of manpower, labor force, together with lots of other elements. Think about the Kumans, etc. In this, we should appreciate how also increasingly dependent the Byzantine Empire was becoming on foreign troops, right? Now, during the Sicilian expedition under Byzantine command, William Iron Arm earned distinction in single combat against the Emir of Syracuse. In fact, he was called Iron Arm because he apparently broke the neck of the Emir with a single fist. Interesting. Now, this gives you a dimension of the anthropometric scale of these Normans. This was a feat involving a direct charge that shattered enemy command cohesion and boosted Norman morale and prestige among local allies by showcasing individual Norman prowess in a theatrical display that chroniclers like Amatus of Monte Cassino later amplified. There's all a very specific Southern Italian Siculo-Norman historiography that at some point we also read, documenting Norman warfare. As we were saying before, rune stones in Sweden commemorated warriors who fell in Langbartaland, underscoring the broader Norse connection to southern Italy through familial and saga memories that linked these expeditions to Scandinavian homelands via oral traditions preserving tales of distant service. Later participants included Anglo-Danish and Norwegian figures such as Edgar the Adeling and Jarl Erling Skakke, while some rebels fleeing Norman England aligned with the Byzantines against Guiscard, bringing, as we were saying before, experience from English campaigns, including knowledge of motte and bailey fortifications and siege techniques adapted for Mediterranean stone-walled cities. Other thing you never have to forget here, that the Mediterranean, particularly Italian infrastructure, is something shocking, right? Not just for somebody coming from Northern Europe, for the scale of medieval civilization, to say the least. And it's even more meaningful that indeed it was not material robustness only, right? You can have a lot of substance, but without form, these strongholds are falling to the greater Norman moral capacity. In many ways, indeed, like this was not feasible in the core lands of the Frankish world, essentially post-Carolingian Europe, right? Vikings, Saracens, Magyars, etc., did not fundamentally alter France, Germany, in this case, central northern Italy. There are, again, exceptions. We have Normandy. It was before the Norse settlement, some sort of relatively underpopulated area. So if we're talking fringe, yeah, they were successful, but in many ways, there was also here a comparative civilization that we should measure the same Normans as you were saying before. They were essentially Western Franks. They were not sort of Scandinavian pirates at this point anymore. And so all this aided the growth of their military culture as well, in for example, engineering adaptations for local terrain featuring karstic features in ancient Roman ruins repurposed as strong points. The earliest documented Norman arrivals in 999 involved also pilgrims returning from Jerusalem who aided. So these were Normans that not just had escorted other pilgrims, but had themselves had their spiritual journey to the Holy Land. And that stopped by the Longobards of Salerno to fight against Saracen raiders that, as we've seen also in the video about Byzantine southern Italy, routinely plagued these areas that could barely defend themselves. I mean, they were just raiders. The Saracens were at this point not really conquering much anymore, especially of the few coastal strongholds that they had importantly established at some point, even in Bari, in Taranto, that had been historically a Franco-Byzantine counterstrike that had cleared them, right? These were usually sort of subsidized really by and acting as proxies on behalf of the Caliphate of Cordoba, mostly. Not only, but still. This situation prompted Prince Guaimar III of Salerno to seek further knights, right? So these Normans joined. The Salernitane tradition, recorded by Amatus of Monte Cassino as well, and echoed in later chroniclers like those of William of Apulia, blended with the Gargano account where pilgrims met Melus of Bari at the shrine of Michael the Archangel, a major pilgrimage site in Apulia symbolizing divine protection for Longobard rebels, leading to joint action against Byzantine authority in Apulia through coordinated uprisings that exploited Byzantine overextension from constant frontier commitments along the Danube and in Asia Minor. This is very interesting because we talk about Melus's revolt. This was the guy, again, of probably Armenian origin even. And the sanctuary of St. Michael in the Gargano Peninsula was an incredibly old Italic shrine since pre-Roman times. And it had at this point hosted the cult of St. Michael that owed much, again, to the even the same Germanic and Irano-Germanic steppe influence of angelic figures as a form of knights coming from the east, etc., that gets popularized also in Byzantine iconography, apparently through the Gepids from the Carpathians along the Danube, that also deeply influenced the Longobards, that assume, as you know, St. Michael is very angelic and etheric at the same time. Warrior saint, he tames rebels, indeed, and at this point it was these rebels that took on instead the idea that they were the rulers. And it was, of course, pairing with the Norman Mont Saint-Michel, which was also joined by the Gargano Sanctuary by yet another Saint Michael, that is the very famous Abbey in the Susa Valley, right? Incredible, beautiful place at the border between France and Italy. And that, in fact, was this symbolic for uniting this historical axis, like France, Lombardy, including also so the entire axis of Western Franco-Roman spiritual hegemony with emperors, popes, in agglutinating this military cult around, in fact, this incredibly etheric figure, right? You can imagine war bands and bonds, indeed, sharing, in fact, oaths among these military enterprises that were deeply soaked in. God knows what 11th century chivalry really retained of those incredibly primitive, archaic, archetypal memories, right, of long Indo-European legacy. Indeed, the shrine encounter symbolized a divinely sanctioned alliance in contemporary accounts, motivating Longobard rebels to view Normans even as liberators from Eastern taxation, Byzantine taxation burdens, and having imperial administrative controls that included direct rule by catapans appointed from Constantinople. Additional narratives link the Drengo brothers' exile after a murder in Normandy to their service under Melos, resulting in the establishment of the county of Ariano as an early Norman political entity recognized around 1022, where its hilltop position in the Irpinia region, these were some of the most austic interlands. Again, this is what the Romans took generations and generations to subdue the native Samnites, right? So we're exactly the same grim, mountainous areas, offering, in fact, great defensive advantages with commanding views over surrounding valleys and trade routes connecting the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian seas, facilitating control over inland passages vital for supply movements amid seasonal transhumance patterns of local herders. Right? The Byzantines called at some point some certain Longobard counts from the hinterland, from the mountains, the wolves, right? That descended in the fertile Apulian plains to raid and plunder, and hopefully get back in time. Actually, the revolt of Melos was crushed, so this eventually did not end particularly well, but it's the first, at least, recorded instance of an actual Norman military activity, right? Albeit not a fortunate one. And so here we should get into the depths of this historiographical tradition, but let's put it in this way. These accounts, though bearing in details such as leadership names like Gilbert, Osmond, or Rudolf, converged on the theme of opportunistic integration into local clashes. Longobard revolts from 1009 to 1022 provided crucial openings, with Melus of Bari's insurrection in the most important Byzantine stronghold on the Apulian Adriatic seaboard, spreading in fact rapidly across the region, overcoming initial imperial responses under catapans like John Courcois and Basil Mesardonitus, whose forces faced challenges from overstretched supply lines across the Adriatic that relied on seasonal shipping, vulnerable to weather, and piracy by Slavic or Islamic raiders. Right, where some, as you know, quite active to be fully Serbian piratic nests, some of which had not yet even converted to Christianity. In fact, one bearing specifically the name of Pagania, right? And these Slavs had infested also the Italian coastlines historically under the Longobards. Byzantine catapans struggled with overstretched supply lines from Constantinople, allowing rebels to seize key inland granaries. Renewed force after 1016 incorporated Norman bands, yielding victories at Arenula, Civita, and Baccarica before the crucial Byzantine success at Cannae in 1018. Yes, the same site of the major Second Punic War showdown, where only a handful of Normans survived. In fact, this is the grim aspect of the story. Melus fled literally to Bavaria, because here you understand also Holy Roman emperors were interested in what was happening. And an event that echoed, in fact, the ancient Roman loss on the same Apulian plains in 216 BC, yet teaching surviving Normans valuable lessons in disciplined withdrawal tactics and the importance of terrain reconnaissance that informed later engagements on the Tavoliere Plateau's open expanses. Ranulf Drengot emerged as a leader among the remnants, leveraging his family ties and pragmatic diplomatic skills to navigate alliances, preventing unified opposition through calculated shifts that extracted fiefs and concessions. Ranulf Drengot is the first ruler, as we'll see now with the county of Aversa, to be properly recognized as a Norman lord in southern Italy. That is in Campania, pretty fertile area, so you understand how also rewarded these leaders were in Longobard service. Holy Roman imperial intervention under Henry II in 1022, including the dramatic punishment of Datus by blinding and execution as a warning to rebels suppressed by the Byzantines, Norman mercenaries continued shifting allegiances to maximize advantage, as observed by Amatus, supporting one side and the other to prevent any single power's total dominance, and thereby extracting concessions like tax exemptions and land grants from weakened lords, a strategy that preserved their autonomy while fostering incremental territorial gains. It works all through deterrence, hush money, military clienteles, and shared revenues of loot, plunder. The emperor had literally descended at, by the way, the demand of the papacy that had been backing these rebels against the Byzantines to, in fact, support them. Right, so this was an anti-Byzantine expedition in particular, but eventually Datus was captured and horrendously slaughtered. So this was a massive slap in the face of the emperor and the pope, but at this provincial level. But it does give you an idea of how Henry's affairs were sort of quite tight in terms of imperial overlordship. It's not like they were fighting over the fortified tower on the Gardena River that Datus had entrenched himself in. There were also many other things happening. We've seen it in the video about Arduin of Ivrea that had rebelled to Henry II, and there had been sort of lots of pretty interesting things happening in the north. But this tells you also how important this frontier was and how much was there to gain there also for the Normans fighting in these affairs. It's this fluid loyalty that preserved Norman autonomy while extracting concessions like tax exemptions from weakened lords. From 1022 to 1046, mercenary roles developed into territorial control. Ranulf Drengot served Guaimar III of Salerno and Pandolf IV of Capua before aligning with Sergius IV of Naples, receiving, as we were saying before, the county of Aversa as a fief in 1030. The site long viewed as the first Norman lordship in Campania, though Ariano held earlier imperial recognition, at least with Aversa's fertile plains supporting agriculture, and settler influxes from Normandy that integrated through intermarriage and adoption of local agricultural techniques like olive cultivation. This is the properly more autonomous settlement of the Normans that grows almost independently, if you want to berate sort of the Lombard powers. Here they were fundamentally, interestingly alone. They were not part of the Byzantine Empire. They were not part of the Holy Roman Empire, or at least they would at some point swing between the two. And so the Normans find in this context like the opportunity of installing themselves as an even more solid wedge. Reinforcements from the north, including Tancred of Hauteville's sons William, Drogo, and Humphrey in 1035, bolstered these efforts, with Tancred's large brood of ambitious sons stemming from his marriages in the Cotentin region of Normandy, creating a familiar network that distributed commands effectively across theaters, mitigating risks of single-line failure through brotherly cooperation and rivalry. It was scattering various war bands under these aristocratic leadership, right, making this youth earning a name in arms, sometimes also in conflict with one another. This will actually remain throughout the various civil wars of the Kingdom of Sicily. All right. Again, vast territory, very easy to nest yourself into and claim, oh, this is just my place, right? These Normans thought, and also Anna Komnena described this as fundamentally peers to even emperors by a degree, and essentially thinking that their control was deeply private, personal. This was a typically Western Frankish mindset. There was no sense of public authority. It was fundamentally a very privatized idea of one owns prerogatives. The Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II's deposition of Pandulf of Capo in 1037 elevated Ranulf Drango further, as we were saying before. And this was done because the Holy Roman Emperors were sort of meddling in these affairs. Like, they were quite careful with the Normans. They understood there was a potential there, right, to weaponize them. It's nothing less than what the Pope will a bit more successfully achieve with them in the south. Because again, imagine this is essentially a contrast with the Byzantine Empire, right, in southern Italy. The Normans are acting as proxies of the Pope, of the Holy Roman Emperors, but they're at the same time operating in a pretty blurred area, right, in this true political, institutional, national gap where it's not entirely clear what kind of political and strategic architecture is being established. The 1038 Byzantine Sicilian campaign again featured Norman participation, but disputes over loot prompted their departure, revealing tensions over division of spoils in a campaign that saw joint operations against Calbit emirs, prompting Normans to prioritize independent operations thereafter to avoid reliance on Byzantine paymasters, whose payments often arrived irregularly due to imperial fiscal strains. One thing had been the planned invasion of Sicily that was essentially aborted because of the death of Basil II. There was another attempt at this point, but let's say there, the possibility of the Byzantine imperial field army to materialize in southern Italy was still present. At this point, that entire Byzantine architecture is starting to fall apart, right? And it's starting properly to unveil the vulnerability of this territory and the fact that the Normans had by now installed themselves there before any other power from the external could basically intervene. We will see now that the popes will try to sort of correct this on their own terms. We're literally defeated and taken prisoner in battle. Now, back on the southern Italian mainland, leadership shifts saw Atenulf and then Argyrus elected, with victories at Olivento. These are Norman leaders, and Montemaggiore in 1041, avenging Canne. So here the Normans are coming back against the Byzantines. The Battle of Monte Peloso, which means hairy mountain, interestingly enough, in 1041, captured Ex Augustus Boioannes, through coordinated cavalry flanking maneuvers that exploited Byzantine. We don't fully know what happened there. We will, if anything, talk about the battle another time. But let's say the Normans were more equestrianly performing than the Byzantines, so it's not like there was some specific rigidity. On the contrary, the Byzantines at most lacked the necessary core, right, of heavy cavalry capable of countering the Normans, right? Yes, you can argue there were the Nicephorian cataphracts the Byzantines had among the most advanced arms and armor of the era, but that system, after Basil II, was sort of giving way to the Western one, but also, a Nicephorian cataphr, there would have been surely some Nicephorian-style cataphract. You know what we're talking about. There was a cavalry reform under Nicephorus. Phocas also made a video about the Byzantine cataphract of this era. It remained around till sort of the mid-12th century. They were technically conceived to destroy literally anything on the battlefield. It was sort of too light in any case to take on these men with armored horse and 3 layers of armor, of actual metal armor plus 2 padded ones on the rider. Literally, these guys charged at pace because it was impossible to move otherwise, but they were so costly that it was impossible to sustain them for a prolonged amount of time, especially on the distant Italian frontier. So the Normans had a much more agile, but still heavily drilled, in particular here by sheer experience, and professional, heavily armored, mounted model that will be the same Western cavalry that will crush further times. In fact, the Byzantine one in open field, like at the Iraqi, utilizing the couché lance technique that was at least sort of taking shape in a more decisive way in mounted combat that allowed knights to deliver concentrated shock impacts while maintaining formation cohesion. If you watch the Bayeux tapestry, it's notorious that Normans still at some point threw javelins before charging to the enemy by softening it up prior. Not even stirrups were universally there yet, but say these guys are becoming ever heavier. They are capable to collectively act in a way that it would impact and run over everything. So they needed to stay better on horseback. There are some higher pommel saddles. There is a heaviness, like there is the need for better suspension with the stirrup, etc. We will talk more about it, but you know fundamentally what I'm talking about. A council at Melfi in 1042 formalized arrangements under Guaimar IV, granting William Iron Arm the county of Apulia entirely. This was a big deal. This was the biggest step because the county of Apulia will remain there, quite importantly, as a major chunk, in fact, of the later Siculo-Norman realm. Melfi's central position in Basilicata served as an ideal assembly point for multi-family Norman forces, while its hilltop location and proximity to routes linking Apulia and Calabria enabled a rapid response to threats from multiple directions. Dominating the uplands here is very important, but also very difficult, because they are also encapsulated. By the way, it's very difficult to dislodge Winabits them. The Longbird establishment will remain quite a pain in the behind for the Normans before the two aristocracies fully merge, marry into one another. Joint operations into Calabria followed, including the construction of Stridula near Squillace, whose fortifications incorporated local stonework for durability against counterattacks, marking early Norman efforts to establish permanent bases in the toe of Italy by adapting to the region's seismic activity in rugged Calabrian mountains. Now, the stone castles are quite important here because this level of material availability was very rare in other parts. In France, definitely you have, as we've seen in the videos about Falconer, etc., the beginnings of stone encastellation with great efforts, right? Encastellation with pretty sound stone material had began, in fact, the most post-Roman and rich areas, literally the Roman countryside, after the defeat of the Muslims at the Garigliano Mount. in the mid-10th century, right? This will take 200 years before it will arrive to the Baltic, right, as a general wave of encapsulation and stone fortification. Here, the Normans definitely drove from plenty of this, for example, classical vestiges that worked literally as stone quarries. The period from 1046 to 1059 marked consolidation around Melfi. Drogo defeated Byzantine forces near Taranto, the most hyper-strategic port that I also made a video on for the famous British raid during World War II, and also the fact that NATO controlled the entire Mediterranean through it during the Cold War, with 3 internal seas, right? The 3 internal gulfs is one. It's unique geography and incredibly important. This was a Spartan colony, famously enough, Taras, and you know that the same issues with Pyrrhus, with part also the Roman expansion passed through the control of the city. Humphrey, in the meanwhile, was weaving alliances. Richard Ringot and Robert Guiscard arrived with fresh knights, because there is this pilgrimage, right, to southern Italy to replenish Norman ranks from the north to establish, in fact, ever better positions and expanding conquest. Guiscard's nickname means the cunning or the wily, reflecting his negotiation tactics alongside battlefield prowess honed in family campaigns that emphasize rapid marches and surprise assaults. Imperial confirmation under Henry III in 1047 granted Drogo titles encompassing Apulia and Calabria, an act aimed to counterbalance papal influence in southern affairs, but inadvertently strengthened Norman claims by providing imperial legitimacy to their holdings amid competing claims for multiple overlords. Right, that's what we were hinting at before. In all of this, the Byzantines remaining pretty much at the window and or fortifying themselves in their last coastal strongholds. The assassination of Drogo in 1051 by Byzantine conspirators elevated Humphrey, who faced papal opposition fueled by Norman treatment of the Longobards. The sense of, say, the Normans taking over here and triggering both Byzantine and papal envy is evident. Right, we're running here because, say, nobody is chasing us, but to say this is just an overview of the world. The Byzantines are cornered and resort to assassination. At the same time, as we were saying before, the Normans are now quite difficultly dislodgeable, and this is a major issue for the papacy that historically had always seen southern Italy, even the currently Islamically occupied Sicily, as in fact a land to reconquer, as historically, since antiquity, the papacy had not only held an incredibly vast amount of latifundia that at some point the Church of Rome was in fact hoping to recover. Right? The Normans are too compact, too successful, and the Pope basically goes at war against them. And that's where you have the famous and aforementioned Battle of Civitate. We are in 1053. Witnessing Humphrey's forces destroy the papal army, with its Lombard and Swabian forces capturing Leo IX himself, right? This battle is very famous for a number of reasons, highlighting the aforementioned military ethnic melange, right? And demonstrating essentially not just the superiority of Norman heavy cavalry over these forces that obviously had their own mounted forces that were also pretty good per se, but with charges breaking coalition lines despite numerical parity. And so indeed there was a Norman quality superiority, and using again the crusade lance tactics refined from earlier Italian battles, as we've seen on the plains near the ancient site here of Civitate, where in fact, the outnumbered Normans under Humphrey routed this papal coalition of Swabians, Italians, and Lombards, led by figures like Gerard, Duke of Lorraine. The big deal of this battle is obviously the international fallout. I mean, the Pope is literally captured, right? And this will bring to essentially a eventually the ransom and the agreement that will fundamentally attribute to the Normans the papal given right to conquer and rule southern Italy, eventually Sicily. The titles associated with were in fact bestowed on the Normans even before the expedition sailed across the Strait of Messina, as we will see now. And it basically showed that Norman power in the southern Italian mainland was, by the mid-11th century, a fait accompli. Right? This is, by the way, the age of the Gregorian reforms, Leo IX being quite crucial to inform the Saint Gregory VII. There is a really massive background here in the emerging struggle between papacy and empire, where the Normans start appearing, if you think about it, in the aftermath of this battle, a valid counterforce to Holy Roman imperial interference in papal affairs, right? The Pope, as we've seen, had used the Holy Roman Emperor to meddle in southern Italian affairs, which had sort of maintained the ambiguity of whose territories are these ones that maybe through our Norman proxies we can't hope to reconquer. Are they imperial? Right? Because the Holy Roman Empire stopped essentially at the frontier with the Byzantine one. Well, now that the latter is evaporating in southern Italy, really, who is in charge here? And the papacy that starts triggering like imperial perplexities regarding what was happening with the establishment of the papal monarchy, the Pataria issues in Milan, that again we covered in multiple occasions. These were very important chapters in medieval history, spirituality, institutions. There is the rise of Milan, and also in a counter-imperial sense already at this point. So all of this makes the papacy realize that effectively maintaining this separated Italian dominations, like the northern within a Germanic sphere and the southern one under Norman control, can basically float in between. They have been doing the same with the Franks and the Byzantines in the same identical manner. There had been a Western preponderance, especially with the Ottonians. There had been appointed popes and so on. It had always tried to claim control of the southern Lombard duchies. Now the Normans are something different, and the papacy starts toying with the idea, in fact, of putting them in charge of southern Italy as a massive papal fief that, as such, would not belong to any other but the Holy See, in a sense escaping, just like the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, there remained something more specifically papally controlled, non-seizable by the Holy Roman Emperor. So this is a massive international move that will change the history of Europe forever. You want to appreciate here also the range of the papal alliance brought at Civitate, regardless of the ultimate defeat. Right, there was some religious. This was a crusade against the Normans. It was provided religious legitimacy that facilitated recruitment from across Western Europe. Exactly because, a bit like the same French and German crusaders will think of the Siculo-Normans later on. This southern world is ambiguous, right? Is obscure, is weak. Archetypically represents this chthonic, sensual, mysterious, infidel, infiltrated, exotic, sort of Byzantine-looking southern world that would have essentially corrupted, say, Norman nature. The French Crusaders called these Normans of the south the Poulains, the Bâtards. It was a sense of distrust towards these peoples who lived, especially with the conquest of Sicily, at contact with the broader Islamic world, entertaining this. Also, there was a bit of envy there because the kingdom of Sicily was a marvel to behold, to say the least, and it surpassed basically other kingdoms of Christianity in power, in wealth, right? But it surely was something different. So southern Italy is a bit of a free-for-all, even for venting Western violence through more channel crusading enterprise, the Normans themselves appeared like an anomaly of some sort, as some sort of globetrotter, some kind of, as we've seen here, even people who had escaped their own country because of criminal activity that were hired also by the Muslims of Sicily that had served also in the Byzantine army. So you can kill these people even if you want, which is paradoxical because the Normans will become eventually, in that purified, papally driven fashion, like some of the greatest enforcers of crusading power, as we now think about the Principality of Antioch, where the Oathville ruled. All right, but this is a bit like, in fact, what happened during the First Crusade in Jerusalem. It didn't matter, like, say, if you were not Roman Catholic, which was taking shape as a much better, more orderly physiognomy, as a not much as a confession at the time, but not even in the moment of the Great Schism. It was not even meant to be definitive in following decades. But a much more better, orderly, hierarchically regulated world where the Normans truly find their place. They are redeemed with their crusader zeal, right, and transcendental strife, right? These other forms of Christianity, you could kill them, just like the Saracens. I mean, who cares about, say, the Eastern Orthodox, after all? They're really too strange and weird at this point. We don't identify them as Westerners anymore. The Pope, against the Normans, had recruited troops from all this vast Western European theater, including knights seeking indulgences and land in a frontier zone, just like what the Normans had been doing themselves, in fact, seizing their land in case of victory over the Oathville, while parallel power centers emerge, as we've seen at Anvers under the Drango, with Richard expanding against Longobard neighbors through sieges and marriages to transfer titles smoothly by preserving local elite status at the same time. There were admittedly certain centers that will not like this Norman imposition. Benevent, the see of the Orleans Duchy, will famously be part of the Papal States because its inhabitants dedicated themselves to the Pope. And so up to pretty late in time, just like the Venice and like Avignon, you're having this this papal state within the Kingdom of Sicily in the Apennine hinterland. Jordan continued the Norman policy aligned with the papacy, however, while conquests extended into the Abruzzo and Molise after Civitate. So that's where immediately, as the Pope is captured, the same ransom entails this new alliance, this new rewiring, right, with the Normans now acting on behalf of the papacy. Geoffroy of Hauteville and his son Robert of Loritello subdued the Longobard counties of Larino and Teate, reaching the Pescara River and respecting papal boundaries after 1080 treaties that secured mountain passes vital for preventing Holy Roman imperial incursions through the Apennines. This is incredibly relevant, speaking of the consolidation of the Apenninic hinterland, because these places in the Abruzzi are particularly strategic, right? They control the mountain passes that bring to southern Italy. In fact, Tagliacozzo, for example, the battlefield of the famous 1268 battle, right, between Coradin of Swabia and Charles of Anjou, lays exactly along these paths across the Abruzzese mountains. Otherwise, the other side is from Rome and from Campania, where there are sort of much more sort of layered, stratified fortifications, a bit more complicated. The Abruzzese area is more strategic. Will actually remain a frontier, but there are also lots of castles there, and it's really difficult to simply pass and maintain a control in your supply lines, right? And the Normans gradually seize these territories, establishing, in fact, a frontier, not just with the papacy, whose rights, as we've seen, in territories they respect, but also with the Holy Roman Empire. After all, they have much to conquer further south. It's not like the Normans will stay simply quiet at some point. They will even sack Rome in the struggles, for example, against Henry IV, right, that fled Rome as the Normans were arriving. The Normans arrived and, actually plundered the city. So it's very interesting to see how complicated, especially Roman politics really was, with also very strong baronial power and an impossibility for anyone to simply control the city, right, from the external. But these sacks do happen as well. We're telling you how sort of ambiguous the relations really were. But overall, internationally, this Papal-Norman alliance makes a lot of sense in southern Italy. Other important centers are seized. Boiano fell under Rudolf of Moulins, with expansions by his grandson Hugh into Venafro and other Capuan holdings by 1105, because basically you still have Longobards noblemen that hold these territories, just as they had always been doing. So you don't simply take over everything. These places are also very difficult to attack at a point. They're either very much enshrined in the mountains. In the 7th century, so the Byzantines had tried to besiege Benevent, that they had failed. Or, like in the latter cases here in the Campanian lowlands that are incredibly rich and therefore also very thickly encastellated, so very, very difficult to move across, right? But these places are secured, together with the Adriatic flanks, and integrating mountainous defensible terrain through new fortifications that blended Norman motte designs with local rocky outcrops for enhanced resistance to siege artillery by the beginning of the 12th century. Fortifications in Molise, in particular, used these natural barriers, right? Eventually, further fortified by the advancing military engineering that Normans brought themselves from France and from the rest of Italy. Very complex history. If you're interested in the full consolidation of Sicilian control on the southern Italian mainland, because that's what happens only at that point, after Sicily was conquered. At this point, Sicily wasn't. You can watch the video about Roger II that explains how all the various rebels of southern Italy are at some point tamed by the greatest fact ruler in the Ottoman monarchy, the same one who became first king of Sicily from an official standpoint. And so how did Sicily happen? In very different ways, as we already premised. The Sicilian theater, initiated in 1061, demanded naval innovation from forces, in fact, inexperienced in large-scale amphibious operations. Yet another proof, by the way, that we're not talking about Vikings, that in any case at this point were fundamentally fading, nor that were capable of sort of threatening the most important Western territories from quite a while. There is a massive level of naval development, as we've seen from the side, especially of the Italian Maritime Republic. At this point, essentially, the Mediterranean becomes an Italian lake. The Normans of Normandy are pretty rough landlubbers of some sort. They are very skilled in terrestrial warfare, but they need now to rely on local resources that there is plenty of in the coastal towns of southern Italy, with lots of, in fact, specialized craftsmen and lots of interland resources. Interestingly enough, initial crossings relied on commandeered Byzantine and local vessels adapted with horse transport modifications, allowing, this is 5 years before Hastings, by the way, so you know more or less also from the Bayeux tapestry what kind of military technology was available at sea, also for amphibious operations. The latter transports allowed in particular knights to maintain mobility upon landing by disembarking ready for immediate charges, a key innovation that preserved cavalry effectiveness as well. Roger Bosso invested as Count of Sicily in 1071, after the fall of Palermo, led initial crossings from Reggio, surprising Messina on the straits through diversionary tactics to draw defenders away from beaches, exploiting surprise in the narrow strait. Alliances with emirs like Ibn al-Timna facilitated inland advances through Rometta and Centuripe. The former was literally the last avant-post that the Byzantines had lost centuries before, right? One of the last holdouts of Ramaioi garrison, mostly was local Sicilians that had put up a quite strong resistance historically. It took centuries for the Muslims to fully conquer the island, after all, very differently from the way Sicily had been conquered by different other peoples historically. And this because apparently, in fact, local population put up an incredibly rough resistance, and the Arabs from Tunisia were not really that power concentrated to simply seize all these territories. They proceeded by war bands in sort of quite relatively clumsy way. Naturally, the Byzantines were still present in the island, but that had been a pretty decentralized position. So it's interesting that the easternmost areas, with Taormina in particular, were the last. This was the largest, sort of the large town to fall, so to say, were the same ones from which the Normans eventually passed. Right. You have the interland position of Castro Giovanni resisting in Islamic hands. As the Normans advanced across the Sicilian interland, they received by the locals crucial local guides familiar with interior routes and knowledge of Islamic factional rivalries that weakened unified resistance across the island's different taifas. There was not really a center of Islamic Sicily. Again, Palermo was the most important center where effectively the Tunisian rulers had established their court. They controlled essentially the western third of the island. The rest was pretty much in the hands of many scattered lords that fundamentally had been always quarreling with one another. And so when the Normans cross in force, really, with a much more compact strategic core, the Islamic unitary response is paralyzed even more than it had historically been. Right? There was no feudal system here. It was not one lordship that had somehow risen provincially more like over the other. This is, again, very different from Southern Italy, where you had, as we've seen, all these various Longobards duchies, certain specific captaincies in Byzantine hands, and more. This is much messier, right, and softer to cut through. It just takes a lot of patience to clear a nest after the other. Very often, this is also negotiated after blockades and so on, so it's not particularly bloody either. Winter returns to the mainland, by the way, alternated with summer campaigns. This is also very interesting because in later medieval history, there's going to be a similar scenario, that is, namely, the one following to the Wars of the Vespers, where the Neapolitan Angevins will launch sort of repeated invasions across the island, mostly plundering the coastal plains. But in that case, they will fail to dislodge the Aragonese. Here it's all very different for a number of reasons, and you want to appreciate Norman determination as well. The 1063 Battle of Cerami secured northeastern footholds against overwhelming odds, while Misilmeri in 1068 further weakened Islamic coordination, where a small Norman force routed a much larger army through disciplined charges, feigned retreats, and exploitation of hilly terrain near Troina, causing lasting divisions among Sicilian Muslim leaders. Palermo's 5-month siege from August 1071 combined Roger's land army with Guiscard's fleet of galleys and transports developed for the campaign. The fleet included specialized horse transports, and blockades prevented resupply. Naval engagements broke harbor chains and burned enemy vessels with coordinated assaults on Alcázar and Alcaleza, overcoming reinforced gates. The two Islamic Arabic names mentioned are Alcázar, meaning the fortress or the castle, which referred to the old fortified upper district and market area of medieval Palermo during Islamic rule. Alcaleza meant the pure or the elect, which referred to the lower, walled administrative and governmental district of Palermo, now known in fact as La Calza, which stems exactly from Alcaleza. Right, so the Italianization, Sicilianization of previous Arabic names. This is very interesting because in part there had been also Arabizations of Latin names prior, but there's also this but we know very few actually about Islamic Sicily, right? Documentation is extremely scarce. Also, the relics of Islamic Sicily are incredibly scarce. Aside from some buildings like the Zis and so on, there is actually not much of an archaeological evidence of this. I mean, it shows you how actually superficial it had been, how non-statally grounded it was. And this is, in fact, a chapter. I already talked about the Saracens in general, and also I made an entire video about Islamic Sicily. You'll find it as well in the topics comment down below. It explains a bit. Also for other videos we're making in depth, like how probably vastly overrated the Islamic domination of Sicily really was. Admittedly, there were interesting technologies were introduced. There are very specific types of irrigations, certain specialized crops, etc. But this also flourished under the Normans, for that matter. And there's this tendency of saying, well, all of this was fundamentally, every time, for example, you see Arab influence art of the beautiful, think about the Palatine Chapel, you find lots of very different, the Monreale Cathedral, etc. The craftsmen may have easily been Christians, right? Aside from the fact that there were still some Muslims in Sicily who were they? They were simply the descendants of the Arabs, the Berbers that had arrived. Not quite, right? There was at some point some Islamicized Latin populace that, of course, it was a great melange of this stuff. There was black Sudanese forces settled at some point, consistent numbers, but at large, right, this is also what we tend to forget, is that not just Sicily had a pretty large population, but that the overwhelming majority was sort of dominant in a historical sense. And so it's very interesting to look at this. The surrender of Palermo in January 1072 preserved much of the Islamic population's rights, right? This is similar to what happens during the Reconquista, where the Mudeyyars were quite needed because there were such a large minority that you couldn't really immediately rule without that. Besides, the Normans in charge already understood that, say, playing on these various groups, say the Muslims, the Orthodox, etc., could basically help balancing the power of different barons that would have installed to dominate the island, right? Norman suzerainty at this point was displayed naturally in ways that were to maintain a continuum for make things flowing smoothly, encouraging, in fact, surrender in later sieges by promising continuity of local customs, religious practice under dhimmi-like protections, and administrative roles for capable officials, right? So, of course, the Muslims were a step under the Christians and the many also other settlers that arrived in Sicily after the conquest, because there was really a lot for many here to seize. But let's say by medieval standards, far from our modern concept of quote-unquote tolerance. Of course, it was a pretty important coexistence. At some point, the Muslims were repressed, but in many ways they were also preserved with their autonomies for the aforementioned reasons. Subsequent reductions targeted western and southern strongholds, that the part of Sicily was left, with Trapani in the far west, yielding after Jordan's sortie disrupted supplies. If you're confused here, we're not talking about the obviously Islamic sortie, because it was the Normans who were besieging, but it's rather that Jordan led a surprise cross-country raid or counter-sortie from the Norman lines as the Muslims were trying to... Jordan was the son of Roger I, by the way, of Hauteville. Right, so while the Normans maintained a tight blockade around Trapani, the city's defenders relied on a nearby peninsula for grazing livestock and securing food supplies. Jordan took a mobile force of Norman knights across the water by ship, hid them overnight, and ambushed the Islamic herdsmen and guards tending to the city's livestock. When the citizens of Trapani rushed out in a large force to chase down the Normans and reclaim their cattle, Jordan feigned a retreat, suddenly turned his heavily armored knights around and fiercely counterattacked. Right, so the Trapani defenders were now routed and driven back into their gates in a panic. With their primary food and livestock supply abruptly cut off and their garrison demoralized by Jordan's tactical strike, the city's resolve collapsed, leading to its surrender. Well, Taormina fell. That is in the opposite of the island, so there were still some areas that had remained isolated and fell later, in this case in 1078, through a circumvallation with 22 wooden forts, a multi-contingent command under leaders including the Saint Jordan and converted Muslims, interestingly enough, like Elias Cartomensis, who exemplified integration of local converts into command roles for cultural intelligence. This also is a massive display of Norman military engineering, right? Taormina is, I don't know if you've ever been to the place, but it's like steeply on cliffs over the sea, so it's very difficult to besiege. That's the same for, as we've seen in the video about Amalfi, that in the immediate interland has just steep rock walls, and you can't basically, but through some passes that are heavily guarded, besiege, especially as they have the galleys. In fact, we have seen in the recent video about 12th century peasant warfare, it's only through that Tuscan naval force that the Normans finally crush Amalfitan autonomy and are able to fundamentally control the place. All right, so it's interesting how all these stories entwine. Now, most importantly in the south is Syracuse, 1086 siege. Followed a naval victory when Benavert drowned after boarding actions. Land forces under Jourdan maintained pressure, however, until leadership flight prompted unconditional surrender after 4 months. The Syracuse naval battle featured close quarters boarding that neutralized Islamic ship advantages through Norman adaptability in Mediterranean waters honed by prior experience with Amalfitan sailors as well. Syracuse naturally was a big old city, and essentially had also been the seat of the Byzantine government back in the day. So it was the second most important center after Palermo from the opposite side. And so it had developed some autonomy. They had some naval capacity. Noto capitulated in 1091, completing the island's subjugation. Malta's 1091 operation involved a rapid descent on Medina, negotiated tribute, and the sacking of Gozo, leaving local administration intact initially to secure vital naval staging points between Sicily and North Africa, enhancing control over sea lanes for trade and future expeditions into Ifriqiya. If you're interested in those, check out my video about Roger II of Sicily. Under him, the Pope had already established certain dioceses, some ecclesiastical administrative districts in North Africa, as Siculo-Norman control was established there. Then things went a bit wrong. There was this constant infiltration, right, from Sicily at that point. Mainland mopping up included Naples, long allied yet gradually absorbed through hostilities with Richard of Capua and blockades in the 1070s to the 1130s, combined with rebellions and imperial interventions under Lothar II. For example, I made a video about this, by the way, culminating in full incorporation by 1139 under Roger II after Sergius VII's death without clear succession. Right. Naples naturally was growing as a major center, will later become, the following century, the capital of the Kingdom of Sicily. It was a massive agricultural market, mostly under the Norman feudalism. These prosper cities that had a potential to become some kind of, in fact, autonomous republics like the ones in central and northern Italy were instead turned into some massive agricultural markets ruled from the hinterland by the various barons occupying, in fact, this vast as fertile hinterland, right? And they had their own important development, urbanly speaking. They had technically their own communes, right? If you study, we don't know too much about it, but they were organized as communes. Those are not differently from the ones in the north, but they didn't have the same level of liberty and power in front of their lord. So it's more similar to something you see, I don't know, in France. Right? We were just discussing the other day with the case of Soissons under Louis VI, Louis VII. Lothar's interventions that we named here highlighted also the ongoing imperial claims that on southern Italy that Roger II deftly neutralized through papal diplomacy and military pressure. He was the first ruler of a whole kingdom of Sicily, as we will see now. the Germans were particularly worried about this massive realm. Again, it was just like the third bigger power here between the Byzantines and the Germans. Amalfi, as we were hinting at before, submitted through negotiation and later sieges despite periodic revolts, underscoring the tendential autonomy of this maritime republic. There were all these coastal cities in Campania, such as Salerno, Naples, Gaeta, etc., that had been prior Byzantine duchies, meaning they were, as we've seen with Amalfi, very difficult to control from the hinterland. Salerno had been actually seized by the Longobards, but it's similar because it's just this governed by this massive rock on the sea. As also, if you have studied the 1943 battle, you have an idea of how difficult it is to attack it from the sea. But the point is that there were some islands basically on the coast. I mean, political islands, former Byzantine duchies separated from the Longobard ones, and they were nominally Byzantine, at least because it was convenient for them to have that imperial recognition, but de facto they operated as autonomous maritime republics, right? And eventually these bigger powers of the hinterland end up, especially with the Normans, to tame them. But they had a potential that was not dissimilar from, or even possibly more advanced by some degree from, the one of places like Genoa in particular. It was not particularly impressive up to this period. The fall of these Tyrrhenian duchies in Norman hand incorporated their naval expertise into the emerging Norman fleet, in fact, contributing shipbuilding knowledge and experienced crews familiar with Latin sails and galley construction. The Siculo-Norman kingdom will never be fully autonomous in a naval sense. It was easier along the way to sort of use some Italian fleets, right, to help, but the kingdom did have a robust shipbuilding capacity, and in fact the Normans in different wars were particularly capable of also amphibious operations. There is the Comnenian invasion of Sicily under Manuel that witnessed, for example, if you look at we shall make a video about that at some point, the Norman counter-strike at Brindisi, both from sea and land. Fantastic operations, really. There they risked to be wiped out by the Byzantines, by the way. And so also as far as benevolent complex transfers that we hinted at before, this reflected the papal-Norman bargaining. By the way, the papacy got an overwhelming amount of ecclesiastical privileges and immunities in southern Italy. In fact, up to the Italian unification, in many ways, like the Sicilian church was infiltrated everywhere in the state. They had massive power, enormous estates, and a lot of progress. The system was enormous. I can't stress enough how, quantitatively speaking, large this domain really was, right? It was incredibly messy to control. It was not even a single country, as you understand. It was more than that. If you're interested, I also made different videos on, in fact, Southern Italian administration throughout all the Norman, Swabian, and Angevin era, because it's incredibly complex. By 1130, Roger II finally unified all these territories into the Kingdom of Sicily on Christmas Day, incorporating Apulia, Calabria, the island, Malta, and mainland extensions with his coronation, drawing on Byzantine ceremonial elements adapted to Western traditions, including elaborate processions and regalia that projected imperial dignity while reframing rather than erasing earlier county structures. It was a, de facto, feudally run, administered system, but with a lot of counter leverages from all these various communities across the straits up to central Italy. Royal authority relied on negotiated aristocratic relationships for military obligations and territorial control, fostering a multicultural administration employing Greek, Arabic, and Latin scribes for efficient governance, drawing on Byzantine fiscal systems for tax collection, Arab agricultural expertise in irrigation and crop rotation, and Latin feudal frameworks to create a sophisticated bureaucratic center in Palermo. When you look at this more closely, this is the narrative, right? That the Normans arrived, they found all this variety of stuff, and basically they kept using it, so as if these systems of government were some fully fledged, unequivocal, statally identifiable administrative infrastructure of some sort. And this is really different, right? They obviously use personnel honed in local administrative practice in the various languages of bureaucracy and so on. But very often it's preserving some offices or the names of them. There's no doubt that the Kingdom of Sicily, as it developed institutionally speaking, was also incredibly innovative and original. I made entire videos mentioning, in fact, the medieval Sicilian legal production was truly unique in medieval Europe because it was the only instance in which it was allowed by constitutional right, fundamentally, that the king had the capacity to fill the gaps existing in pre-existing customs with laws that he issued on behalf of God, basically. And this is as far as statal centralization the Western Middle Ages go, right? I will not digress on how, as you know, the system worked, because otherwise sort of the base was, in any case, similar to the sum of customary feudal law and one of the various localities, etc. But the Kingdom of Sicily is by far the single most administratively advanced in the High Middle Ages. There is no doubt whatsoever about this across the entire Latin Germanic world. And by extension at this point, considering that sort of the Arabic world had somehow collapsed into some more privatized fashion, the Byzantines also were essentially sort of deteriorating themselves as well. This was essentially the single most advanced institutional system, right? Even more efficient than the Anglo-Norman one, that especially at the beginning was a bit sort of perhaps overstated in actual power concentration capacity. Differently from later sort of 12th and especially 13th century England, that was really very advanced for its times. And castellation accelerated, right? So this military engineering was brought to alter the landscape of southern Italy from, again, northern France, converting wooden defenses to stone, which admittedly had already been quite available locally. And so mostly founding new fortresses to dominate more strategically vaster areas, as we've seen. Expanding sites, in fact, like Melfi, with rectangular keeps and integrated mountain fortifications in Molise, demonstrating adaptation to local topography through use of local limestone and labor forces. Stone upgrades improved resistance to siege engines while maintaining rapid construction timelines using, in fact, local communities and materials. Architecture blended Romanesque, Byzantine, and Islamic influences in cathedrals and palaces, particularly in Palermo, where structures like the Palatine Chapel featured gold mosaics, muqarnas ceilings, and inscriptions in multiple languages, symbolizing cultural synthesis that included Arab geometric patterns alongside Norman robust arches. And these buildings are, of course, some of the single most important in the entire history of mankind, right? There's no doubt. We will surely make entire videos about secular Norman art that was, ferociously advanced. The Hauteville line through Guiscard's death in 1085 on Cephalonia during the Balkan campaigns against the Byzantines and Roger's rule until 1101 transmitted authority via successors like Roger Borsa and Roger II, whose bloodline later connected to Hohenstaufen through Constance, the last of the Hauteville, the heiress of the Hauteville, with, in fact, the preservation overall of the clan's leadership across the Mediterranean. Again, they had also other territories, the Principality of Antioch that we recently discussed in our videos about William IX of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France as far as their crusade efforts and Antiochian support on that occasion. We've seen, again, in the video about not just the one on the Battle of the Dyrrhachium, but also the ones about Alexius I. And I made also a video about Norman Byzantine warfare that exemplifies this, how Guiscard's Balkan expeditions had been testing naval logistics. The Normans had arrived to attack Thessaloniki. They had not tried to push toward Constantinople, but that was their main aim, right? And during the Crusades, it could happen eventually that Southern Italy would allow, in quite sort of expandable potential, the conquest of Constantinople. As you know, Henry VI of Swabia died in 1196 before launching his otherwise already prepared crusade, and the expedition would have likely seized Constantinople. Instead, it was 8 years later that the French and the Venetians did that. So just for telling you, how later Charles of Anjou, before the Sicilian Vespers that broke out exactly to prevent this, had also practically all the cards to simply march on Constantinople because there was no resistance and no defense there. But that's for other videos, but just for telling you how much military history there is behind this, right? All the Norman fleet coordination across the Adriatic against the Venetians, by the way, at that point back the Byzantines. The same Sicilian defense was entrusted to the fleet, as well as the North African projections. At some point, it was a kingdom of Africa established. Roger II was king of Sicily and of Africa, as a matter of fact. It was his official titling. And so we have really scratched the surface of this. Again, I have more in-depth videos. Now we will see them perhaps in the end as a recap about Norman warfare, the Siculo-Norman kingdom, probably the most other channels altogether. However, right, it's really a massive tapestry. There is no equivalent of the Bayeux tapestry for the Siculo-Normans. You have something in Scandinavia with the Baldachal tapestry and etc. But unfortunately, we're more tied otherwise to the pretty good documentation. Siculo-Norman warfare. I mean, just for the fact that Anna Comnena described the Normans, we're incredibly blessed, divinely blessed. And so, really, to sum this up very briefly, this military development rooted in mercenary adaptability, cavalry dominance in battles like Olivento, Montemaggiore, and Cerami, and mastery of sieges from Bari to Palermo and Syracuse, produced a durable polity where cavalry tactics emphasized shock charges with couché lances refined through repeated Italian engagements. It's the experience here that matters on varied terrains from plain to hills that were all seized eventually by these rulers as lords of the same lands. Naval developments from ad hoc use of conquered fleets to blockades and horse transports proved really crucial in island operations. Across the Mediterranean, horse transports allowed mounted forces to disembark ready for immediate action. A key innovation, if anything, developing that those already existed. We've seen it also in the video about the Byzantine dromons, but say what cavalry here, the Western Frankish one, and so preserving its effectiveness in amphibious assaults by minimizing dismounting vulnerabilities. Landings are incredibly risky, just like crossings in general. And so this process integrated different forces: Norman knights, Lombard infantry, Greek sailors, Islamic auxiliaries, perhaps Southern Italian town militias, as we said before, also considering their Byzantine military legacy, should be very much credited with a lot of the levies. As we've seen at the Battle of the Dyrrhachium, apparently the sources tried to scapegoat some of the initial wearing of Norman lines on these very elements, right? But we're not 100% sure. The Normans were very sort of snubbed. They thought incredibly high of themselves. They consider, again, the Southern Italians as some sort of inferior race of sorts. So they did not publicize them all. But actually, much of these places were highly civilized. And if anything, as you understand here, it's mostly like a Norman Lombard establishment to begin with, and even the Byzantine and Islamic held areas, yes, were sort of less sort of courageous, less robust, but they provided really a great deal of shipbuilding capacity. In any case, town watch force, like, so it's not to be depreciated, right, per se. All this happening under leaders whose personal prowess and strategic marriages sustained momentum across generations, with Islamic auxiliaries, for example, contributing archery and light cavalry skills, really essential for skirmishing and reconnaissance in Sicilian interiors, characterized by rugged mountains and coastal plains. As you know, Frederick II of Sicily at some point will deport the remnants of these Saracens in Sicily to the military colony of Lucera, that will in northern Apulia, a very strategic location. The Angevins used them later for a while. They were not a great innovation. They didn't actually contribute very much to. Frederick II's army was not as advanced as we thought. It was a typical feudal army of the time. His Lombard opponents were already more sophisticated. The Angevins first used those Saracens and exterminated them. Just for telling you how it ended. There's a beautiful castle there that, in any case, one of the many vestiges of this feudal past of southern Italy. By the kingdom's formation, southern Italy had, in fact, transitioned from contested borderlands to a concentrated Mediterranean power. Right? This concentration enabled later projections of power into North Africa, establishing a prosperous multicultural realm that endured influences for centuries through its quote-unquote tolerant policies, advanced administration, featured trilingual chancelleries, and strategic location astride major trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, and the Levant, all during the Crusade era, dominating the straits, brought enormous profit, for not talking about sort of contributing to the same Crusade conquest, as we've seen also in the video about the Battle of Antioch and the various Hauteville contributions to the Outremer state's military history. All right, so there is an enormous history behind this. It was effectively the second largest Mediterranean power after the Byzantine Empire. Right, there is no doubt about this. Not even Egypt can simply rank as such unless we count the wall eventually of the Fatimid and Ayyubid rule. But say we're equivalent in scale in any case, and it's surely the largest Mediterranean power in the West, right, as a Latin Germanic power, and it's something that you really, again, see. I've seen lots. Probably this video is going to get lots of views, just because, aside from the pictures that have been widely publicized on X, for some reason I'm getting really lots of likes for this stuff on there. But it's really the relevance of the topic. I really detest it when this is marketed like, oh look, did you know there was actually a Norman kingdom in southern Italy, or do you know, look at the Vikings in southern. It's nothing to do with the Vikings per se. It's something completely different and adversarial to the Vikings. As a matter of fact, if you look at Byzantine military history and the Wolf-Varangian legacy in there that oppose, in fact, the Siculo-Norman. They really hated each other guts. I mean, all those Anglo-Danish refugees hated the Normans like hell. So there are very beautiful vestiges of this. In Albania, there is a place where there's an engraved symbol of a dragon that is identical to the draco displayed by the Anglo-Danes in the Bayeux tapestry. And then they're like, well, okay, I made multiple videos also on 11th century kite shape shield, so-called heraldry, let's say, symbols. And it's always a pleasure to talk about this. And I felt the need really to make a video like this, good solid couple of hours, not even entering the deepest details, but say giving sort of pretty broader picture of the wall here. Let's see, Norman history, 27 videos, and I put literally everything, including World War II here, so it would be the Siculo-Normans, only 11 videos, and this is criminal. Indeed, we really need to make much more about this, because it's It's simply one of the single most important chapters in medieval Europe. Like you can't really avoid this, and I'm glad, if anything, that in the last year we made at least a bit more about it, and we have to do so also for the Anglo-Normans a little bit. I'm sure I could sort of discuss this further, but I think that this is more or less what we had to tell. I should make a video about this is never really done about the Normans as such, because there's medieval Normandy, Norman history, secular Normans, Norman warfare, and Anglo-Normans. No, I want the Normans, really, in medieval Norman warfare as well. So again, now we will be creating it. So not now maybe, but that's partially what the point is. But I mean, restoring a bit the history also of the later Kingdom of Sicily, its protagonists. This is really necessary. We can't go on like this without really talking more about Southern Italian history. We really covered really a lot of stuff, and this is one of the weakest areas that we have on Schwerpunkt. Like, we must consolidate way more. And it's not like we haven't, of course, already covered some important figures, but again, there is definitely much more to do. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.